April 1941. The most feared army on the planet rolls toward a tiny port in the Libyan desert. German panzers, Stukas, the unstoppable Afrika Korps, led by the legendary Desert Fox himself. And standing in their way, 25,000 Australians that British High Command had already written off as dead men. Here is what the history books do not tell you. Those British generals, they did not just abandon these soldiers. They actively despised them, called them undisciplined rabble, armed vagrants, a disgrace to the uniform. And yet, when Rommel threw everything he had at that garrison, something impossible happened, something that would humiliate the German war machine and expose a scandal that London tried to bury for decades. Why did Churchill himself call the Australian demand for evacuation tantamount to desertion? What really happened in those secret cables between London and Canberra? And why did Rommel, the most brilliant tactician of the war, admit that these ragged colonial troops were the finest soldiers he ever faced? The answers will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. This is the story of the Rats of Tobruk. The men who turned a Nazi insult into a battle cry. The men who owned the night while German soldiers trembled in their foxholes. The men who held for 240 days against odds that should have killed them all. Stay until the end, because what the British tried to hide about this siege, it is far worse than you imagine. The date was April the 10th, 1941. German panzer columns rolled toward the Libyan port of Tobruk with the unstoppable momentum of a desert storm. Behind them lay the wreckage of British hopes in North Africa. Ahead of them stood 25,000 Australian soldiers who had just received the most insulting order of the war. Hold Tobruk, no retreat, no surrender, no reinforcements. The British High Command had already written off these men. General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Forces, privately told Winston Churchill that Tobruk would fall within 2 weeks. The garrison was expendable, a speed bump on Rommel's road to Cairo. But Wavell made a catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot one crucial detail. These were not British soldiers trained to follow orders without question. These were Australians, and Australians had a very different relationship with authority, with warfare, and with the concept of impossible odds. But this was only the beginning of a collision that would reshape the entire North African campaign. What followed was 240 days of siege warfare that would shatter the myth of German invincibility, humiliate the Desert Fox, and create a legend that still echoes across the Australian national consciousness. It would also ignite a bitter feud between Australian commanders and British generals that nearly fractured the Allied war effort. This is the story of the Rats of Tobruk, the men who refused to salute their superiors, the men who wore threadbare uniforms and carried rifles older than their fathers, the men who British officers called undisciplined rabble, and the men who Erwin Rommel himself admitted were the finest soldiers he ever faced. Yet to understand why these men fought the way they did, we must first understand where they came from. The breed. Apart. To understand why the siege of Tobruk became such a flashpoint between Australian troops and British command, you must first understand what kind of men filled the ranks of the 9th Australian Division in 1941. They were not professional soldiers. The Australian Imperial Force was an entirely volunteer army. Every single man in Tobruk had chosen to be there. They had left sheep stations in Queensland, wheat farms in Victoria, and mining camps in Western Australia. They had crossed 12,000 miles of ocean to fight a war that many Australians believed was Britain's problem, not theirs. The average age was 26. Most had grown up during the Great Depression, scraping survival from a continent that offered nothing for free. They knew hunger. They knew hardship. They knew that complaining accomplished nothing. But they also carried a cultural inheritance that British officers found deeply unsettling. And that inheritance was written in blood at a place called Gallipoli. Their fathers had been the original ANZACs, the men who had charged into Ottoman machine guns at Gallipoli in 1915 because British generals assured them the Turkish defenses would be suppressed by naval bombardment. They were not. 30,000 Australians and New Zealanders had perished on those beaches. Many of those who survived came home with a permanent distrust of British military competence. That distrust was genetic by 1941. The diggers who arrived in the Middle East in 1940 had already demonstrated their attitude problem to British sensibilities. They refused to salute officers they did not respect. They called their commanding general by his first name. They ignored dress regulations with cheerful contempt. One British staff officer described them in an official report as resembling a mob of armed vagrants rather than a military formation. This assessment was technically accurate. It was also completely irrelevant to their fighting capability. What the British failed to grasp was that sloppiness in the barracks meant nothing about performance in battle. Because these same undisciplined vagrants had just completed a stunning campaign against the Italian 10th Army in Libya. In 2 months of desert warfare, 33,000 Australians had captured 130,000 Italian prisoners, 400 tanks, and over 1,000 artillery pieces. They had advanced 800 miles across terrain that military experts considered impassable. They had done this while receiving approximately 1/10 of the supplies allocated to British divisions. They had done it with equipment so outdated that their own officers filed formal protests with Middle East Command. They had done it because they were very, very good at war. But Britain did not want good soldiers. Britain wanted obedient soldiers, and this fundamental disconnect would poison relations throughout the siege. However, a far more dangerous problem was racing across the desert toward them. The Desert Fox arrives. General Erwin Rommel landed in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, with orders to prevent a complete Italian collapse in North Africa. Within 6 weeks, he had transformed a defensive mission into an offensive masterpiece that threatened to push the British Empire out of Africa entirely. Rommel possessed qualities that British generals found baffling and Australian soldiers instinctively recognized. He led from the front, often driving his command car into enemy fire. He improvised constantly, abandoning textbook doctrine whenever opportunity presented itself. He treated military regulations as suggestions rather than commandments. In other words, he fought like a digger. The German counteroffensive caught British forces completely unprepared. Wavell had stripped the North African theater to send troops to Greece. Another strategic disaster in the making. The British 2nd Armored Division, undermanned and poorly equipped, disintegrated within days. By April 6th, Rommel's forces had recaptured all of Cyrenaica, except for one stubborn port city, Tobruk. But the decision to defend this port would not be made by the men who would have to bleed for it. The decision to hold Tobruk was not made by the men who would have to hold it. It was made in London, in Cairo, in comfortable headquarters far from the sand and the shells. Churchill needed a victory, or at least the absence of another humiliating defeat. Wavell needed to protect his supply lines for the inevitable counteroffensive. Neither man particularly cared what holding Tobruk would cost in Australian lives. General Leslie Morshead, commander of the 9th Australian Division, received his orders on April 7th. He was to defend Tobruk against the full weight of the Afrika Korps with whatever forces he had available. Reinforcement was impossible. Relief was indefinite. Surrender was not an option. Morshead was a veteran of Gallipoli. He understood exactly what British High Command was asking him to do. He also understood that his men would do it anyway, not because London ordered them to, but because Australians did not run from fights. But he made one thing absolutely clear to his British superiors. His men would fight their way, not the British way, and if the brass in Cairo did not like it, they were welcome to come to Tobruk and take over command personally. Not a single British general accepted that invitation. Now Morshead faced the task of turning a crumbling Italian fortress into something that could stop panzers. The perimeter Tobruk in April of 1941 was not an impressive military position. The port itself was a modest harbor, capable of handling small convoys. The town was a collection of whitewashed buildings, already scarred by Italian occupation and British bombardment. The defensive perimeter stretched for 30 miles across open desert. The Italians had constructed the original fortifications during their colonial occupation of Libya. Concrete bunkers dotted the perimeter at irregular intervals. An anti-tank ditch, partially filled with sand, traced a rough semicircle from coast to coast. Wire obstacles covered some approaches, but not others. These defenses had been designed to hold off lightly armed Senussi tribesmen. They had not been designed to stop panzer divisions supported by dive bombers and artillery. General Morshead surveyed the perimeter on April the 8th and issued orders that would define the entire siege. Every bunker would be manned around the clock. Every gap in the wire would be covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Every soldier would memorize his sector so thoroughly that he could fight in complete darkness, and every soldier would conduct aggressive patrols into no man's land every single night. This last order was the key to everything that followed. British defensive doctrine called for holding a line and waiting for the enemy to attack. Morshead rejected this completely. His men would not sit in their bunkers counting shells. They would go out into the darkness and kill Germans. The patrols served multiple purposes. They gathered intelligence about enemy positions and movements. They disrupted German preparations for attacks. They captured prisoners for interrogation. But most importantly, they established a psychological dominance that Rommel's troops never overcame. Within the first week of the siege, German soldiers learned to dread the hours between sunset and sunrise. Australian patrols moved through the desert with a silence that seemed supernatural. They appeared out of nowhere, killed sentries with bayonets and knives, vanished before reinforcements could respond. The Germans began calling the night Australian time. They built their fires smaller, they spoke in whispers, they reinforced their outposts, and still lost men. And they started to believe that the garrison they were supposed to destroy was not quite human. But Rommel was not a man who accepted delay. His response would come with overwhelming force. The first assault. Rommel attacked Tobruk for the first time on April the 13th, 1941. He expected the battle to last approximately 48 hours. The plan was straightforward by blitzkrieg standards. German and Italian infantry would breach the perimeter at multiple points along the southern sector. Panzers would exploit the gaps, driving toward the harbor. The garrison would be fragmented, surrounded, and forced to surrender before they could organize an effective defense. Rommel had used this formula successfully across Poland, France, and Libya. He had no reason to believe it would fail against a collection of colonial troops with outdated weapons. The assault began at dawn with a concentrated artillery bombardment. Stukas screamed down from cloudless skies, dropping bombs on bunkers and communication trenches. Italian infantry advanced toward the perimeter under cover of dust and smoke. They walked into a killing ground. Morshead had positioned his heaviest firepower along the southern sector specifically because he anticipated exactly this approach. Australian machine gunners waited until the Italian columns were within 500 yards. Then they opened fire simultaneously from positions the attackers had not detected. The first wave of Italian infantry was annihilated in less than 15 minutes. Survivors retreated in disorder, leaving the desert floor carpeted with bodies and abandoned equipment. German officers watching through binoculars reported that the defensive fire was far heavier than intelligence had predicted. But Rommel was not finished. He had panzers, and panzers had never been stopped by infantry. Rommel responded by committing his panzers earlier than planned. 38 tanks from the 5th Panzer Regiment rolled toward the perimeter, expecting to simply crush any resistance that remained after the infantry attack. What happened next entered Australian military legend. The diggers had positioned their anti-tank guns in concealed pits dug during the previous week. They held fire until the panzers were within 400 yards. Then they opened up with 2-pounder guns that British ordnance experts had declared obsolete. The 2-pounder was theoretically incapable of penetrating the armor of a Panzer Mark III at any range. Australian gunners demonstrated that theoretical capability and actual results were entirely different matters when the men behind the guns refused to miss. They aimed for tracks, for vision slits, for the vulnerable rear armor exposed when tanks maneuvered. They fired until their gun barrels glowed red. They kept firing when German return fire killed their crews and new volunteers dragged the bodies aside to take their places. 17 German tanks burned on the perimeter that day. 21 more were damaged severely enough to require evacuation. The Panzer Regiment that attacked the perimeter at dawn was combat ineffective by noon. Rommel called off the assault at 1400 hours. He had lost more armored vehicles in 6 hours at Tobruk than in the entire campaign to date. He had not penetrated the perimeter at any point. He had not even come close. And he had learned that the intelligence reports describing the Australians as second-rate troops were catastrophically wrong. But the Desert Fox did not accept defeat easily. He would try again, and this time he would bring everything he had. The German reaction. The German High Command did not believe the first reports from Tobruk. Rommel himself radioed Berlin that the attack had encountered unexpected resistance but would succeed within days. Staff officers in Germany assumed the delay was caused by supply difficulties or Italian incompetence. They could not imagine that a surrounded garrison with no air cover and limited ammunition had stopped the most successful armored force in military history. Rommel tried again on April the 16th with a modified plan. This time, the attack would focus on a narrow sector in the southwest where aerial reconnaissance showed fewer defensive positions. German infantry would advance at night to avoid the devastating machine gun fire that had shattered the first assault. Panzers would be held in reserve until the infantry had secured a breakthrough. The night approach negated some of the defenders' advantages. German troops reached the perimeter wire without catastrophic losses. Engineers cut gaps while infantry provided covering fire. By midnight, elements of 2 German battalions had penetrated the outer defensive line. Then, the Australians counterattacked. This was not supposed to happen. Surrounded defenders were supposed to contract their perimeter and conserve strength. They were supposed to trade space for time. They were not supposed to launch battalion-strength assaults against troops who had just breached their defenses. But nobody had told the diggers what they were supposed to do. The diggers came out of the darkness, with bayonets fixed, screaming obscenities in accents the Germans could not understand. There was no preliminary bombardment, no careful coordination, just a wave of furious men who had apparently decided that the best way to defend their positions was to attack anyone who approached them. The fighting in the breach lasted until dawn. It was close-quarters combat of a savagery that German veterans compared to the worst nights of the First World War. Men killed with rifles and bayonets and entrenching tools and bare hands. The wounded on both sides crawled through the chaos, trying to find their own lines. By sunrise, the breach was closed. German forces had been pushed back beyond the wire. Australian burial parties counted over 300 enemy bodies within the perimeter. The Germans lost another 8 tanks to Australian guns during the confused night fighting. Rommel reported to Berlin that the garrison was stronger than anticipated and requested reinforcements before attempting another major assault. This was the first time in the war that Erwin Rommel had admitted he needed help to defeat an enemy. Yet while the Australians celebrated their victory, a different kind of battle was brewing far from the front lines. The propaganda war. While Australian soldiers fought and perished in the desert, a different battle raged in the realm of information, and this battle revealed the contempt that British authorities held for their colonial allies. Lord Haw-Haw, the Nazi propagandist broadcasting from Berlin, announced in late April that the German High Command had nicknamed the Tobruk garrison the Rats of Tobruk. The term was intended as an insult. Rats were vermin to be exterminated. Rats hid in holes. Rats were beneath contempt. The Australians heard this broadcast on captured German radios and immediately adopted the name with fierce pride. Within days, soldiers throughout the garrison were calling themselves rats. They fashioned rat badges from whatever materials they could scrounge. They composed obscene songs about being rats. They painted rat emblems on their vehicles and bunkers. The transformation of an insult into a badge of honor was pure Australian lyricanism. But it was also a calculated psychological response that demonstrated exactly how little the diggers cared about enemy opinion. British propaganda authorities were horrified. The Ministry of Information wanted clean-cut heroes for the newsreels, not soldiers who proudly called themselves vermin. They attempted to suppress the rat's nickname in official communications and news reports. The Australians responded by using it more aggressively. Australian newspapers, operating under less rigid censorship than their British counterparts, published letters from Tobruk soldiers embracing the rat identity. The term became a rallying cry across Australia. Families of soldiers in the garrison began calling themselves rat families. The nickname that Goebbels intended to humiliate the defenders instead unified them. This episode illustrated a fundamental difference between British and Australian military culture. The British Empire relied on prestige and dignity to maintain authority. Australia had no interest in either, but prestige and dignity could not fill empty stomachs or replace spent ammunition, and the supply situation was about to become critical. The supply nightmare. Sieges are won or lost on logistics. The garrison at Tobruk consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies. Every round fired, every meal eaten, every wound bandaged, depleted reserves that could only be replenished by sea. The Royal Navy ran convoys into Tobruk harbor throughout the siege, usually at night, to minimize exposure to Luftwaffe attacks. These destroyers became the lifeline of the garrison, threading through minefields and air patrols to deliver the materials that kept 25,000 men alive and fighting. Australian soldiers called these ships the Tobruk Ferry Service. British sailors called the runs to Tobruk the most dangerous duty in the Mediterranean. Losses were severe. German bombers sank or damaged destroyer after destroyer. Supply ships went down with holds full of ammunition that the garrison desperately needed. Convoy schedules became increasingly erratic as the Royal Navy struggled to maintain enough vessels to keep Tobruk supplied. The shortages affected everything. Water was rationed to 1 gallon per man per day for all purposes. In desert heat that routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, this allocation was barely sufficient for drinking. Washing became a distant memory. Men wore the same uniforms for weeks at a time, fabric stiffening with accumulated sweat and dust. Food arrived in quantities that would have caused riots in British barracks. The standard ration was bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and tinned vegetables stretched far beyond manufacturer recommendations. Fresh food was so rare that men remembered individual meals with fruit or bread months later. But the worst shortage was the one that could get them all killed. Ammunition was counted with miserly precision. Machine gunners learned to fire short bursts rather than sustained volleys. Artillery batteries received allocations per day that would not have lasted 10 minutes in a normal engagement. Every shell was precious. Every bullet had to count. Medical supplies ran critically low by June. Doctors performed surgeries without adequate anesthesia. Wounded men waited days for evacuation that might never come. The field hospitals filled beyond capacity and stayed that way. British staff officers in Cairo compiled reports about supply difficulties in Tobruk with bureaucratic detachment. They noted shortages without acknowledging that those shortages were costing lives. They recommended economies that were already being practiced to the point of starvation. General Morshead sent message after message demanding increased supply convoys. He received polite assurances that everything possible was being done. He knew this was not true. The truth was that Middle East Command had allocated resources based on which operations might produce quick victories for Churchill to announce. Tobruk was a holding action, not a prestige project. It received leftovers. Australian soldiers endured these privations without the courtesy of knowing they were considered expendable. And while they starved and thirsted, Rommel was preparing his largest assault yet. The Easter Battle. Rommel's largest assault on Tobruk began on April the 30th, 1941, and extended through the first days of May in what the Australians would remember as the Easter Battle. This was the offensive that tested the garrison most severely and revealed both the extraordinary courage of the defenders and the limitations of the British support they received. The German plan called for a breakthrough in the southwestern sector near a position the Australians had designated as Hill 203. If tanks could penetrate the perimeter here, they would have a clear run to the harbor, only 10 miles away. Rommel committed his best units to the assault, including elements of the prestigious 15th Panzer Division that had arrived from Italy specifically for this operation. The attack achieved initial success. German infantry overwhelmed several forward posts during the night approach. Panzers rolled through gaps in the wire as dawn broke on May the 1st. For the first time in the siege, enemy armor was operating inside the main defensive perimeter. General Morshead faced a crisis that demanded immediate response. Standard doctrine called for falling back to secondary defensive lines and containing the breakthrough until reinforcements could close the gap. Morshead rejected this approach. He ordered an immediate counterattack with every available man. The Australians attacked German tanks with weapons that should not have been effective. They threw grenades under the tracks, they climbed onto hulls, and dropped explosives through hatches. They charged armored vehicles with rifles and bayonets because that was what they had. The fighting around Hill 203 lasted 4 days. During this time, the Australians destroyed or captured 87 German tanks. They lost over 500 men in close combat of appalling intensity. They refused every opportunity to pull back to more defensible positions. One incident from this battle became legendary throughout the garrison. A German panzer broke through to the battalion headquarters of the 24th Australian Infantry Brigade. Rather than evacuate, the headquarters staff grabbed whatever weapons they could find and attacked the tank on foot. The battalion cook, armed only with a cleaver, was last seen attempting to climb onto the tank's engine deck before machine gun fire cut him down. The tank was eventually destroyed by a 2-pounder gun that a sergeant dragged into position by hand after its transport vehicle was knocked out. The sergeant fired 4 rounds at point-blank range, then walked back to his original position to retrieve ammunition for another engagement. This was not heroism as Hollywood imagined it. There were no dramatic speeches, no patriotic music, no clean endings. There was only a desperate determination to hold ground that should have been indefensible. By May the 4th, the Easter battle was over. Rommel had lost more tanks in 4 days than he could replace in 4 months. He had not reached the harbor. He had not even come close to reaching the harbor. And he had developed a respect for Australian soldiers that would last the rest of his life. But while the diggers celebrated their survival, very different conclusions were being drawn in Cairo. The British view. While Australians celebrated the defeat of Rommel's Easter offensive, British headquarters in Cairo recorded a very different interpretation of events. Official reports acknowledged that the garrison had held, but attributed this success to German overextension rather than Australian combat effectiveness. Staff officers noted the high casualty rates among Australian units and questioned whether such aggressive tactics were sustainable. Memoranda circulated suggesting that the Tobruk defenders were wasting ammunition through undisciplined fire. These assessments reached General Morshead through channels that were not supposed to leak. His response was volcanic. Morshead fired off a series of communications to Middle East Command demanding that British staff officers either visit Tobruk to see actual conditions or stop commenting on operations they did not understand. He pointed out that his men were holding a position that British intelligence had declared indefensible, with resources that British logistics had declared inadequate. The reply from Cairo was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension. Middle East Command appreciated the efforts of the garrison and was confident that continued resistance would be possible with improved supply efficiency. Perhaps if the Australians reduced their patrol activity and conserved ammunition, the logistical burden would become more manageable. Morshead interpreted this as an order to sit in bunkers and wait to be attacked. He ignored it completely. The patrols continued. The ammunition expenditure continued. The Germans continued losing men every night to raiders they could not catch. But the friction between Australian commanders and British headquarters had reached a point that would soon have strategic consequences. Meanwhile, summer was arriving in the Libyan desert, and with it came a new kind of warfare. The War of the Nights. Summer arrived in the Libyan desert, with temperatures that made daytime operations nearly impossible. Both sides adjusted their routines. Major movements occurred at dawn and dusk. The middle of the day became a period of enforced inactivity when even breathing required conscious effort. This schedule favored the Australians, who had developed night operations into a lethal art form. The patrol system that Morse had established during the first week of the siege had evolved into something unprecedented in the Desert War. Australian raiding parties operated every night, penetrating German lines to distances that should have been impossible for forces without armored support. The tactics were simple and brutal. Small groups of 5 to 10 men would crawl through no man's land after full dark, navigating by stars and memorized landmarks. They carried minimal equipment, usually rifles, grenades, and fighting knives. They moved in absolute silence, communicating through hand signals and pre-arranged codes. Their targets varied. Some nights they hunted sentries, killing them quietly and withdrawing before alarm could spread. Some nights they raided supply dumps, destroying what they could not carry away. Some nights they attacked artillery positions, spiking guns that had been shelling the perimeter during daylight. The Germans responded with increased security measures. They planted minefields around their forward positions. They doubled sentry rotations. They deployed guard dogs trained to detect approaching enemies. The Australians adapted to every countermeasure. They learned to locate minefields by observing where German patrols walked. They timed their approaches to coincide with sentry changes when attention was divided. They discovered that guard dogs could be neutralized with meat laced with sedatives stolen from medical supplies. By June, German forces facing Tobruk had effectively ceded the night to their enemies. Rommel complained in letters to his wife that his troops were suffering from sleep deprivation because they could not close their eyes after sunset without risking their throats being cut. This was not an exaggeration. Australian patrol records from June and July document an average of 12 German casualties per night from raiding activity alone. This rate of attrition was unsustainable for a besieging force that depended on maintaining numerical superiority. The psychological impact exceeded the material losses. German soldiers began to believe that the Australians possessed supernatural abilities. Rumors spread through the Africa Corps that the garrison included Aboriginal trackers who could move invisibly through the desert. Other rumors claimed the Australians were all convicted criminals released from prison on condition of military service. Both rumors were false. The truth was simpler and more impressive. The Australians were just very good at killing. But even the most effective killers grow tired, and the siege was grinding toward a crisis point. The stalemate. By July of 1941, the siege of Tobruk had settled into a pattern that neither side could break. German forces lacked the strength to overwhelm the defenses after their losses in April and May. Australian forces lacked the strength to break out without support that was not coming. The garrison was slowly being ground down. Casualties from combat were significant but manageable. Disease was a more serious threat. Dysentery swept through units that could not maintain basic sanitation. Eye infections blinded men who spent hours staring into desert glare. Skin conditions from dirt and sun made every movement painful. Mental health deteriorated in ways that nobody discussed. The constant shelling created a condition that would later be recognized as combat fatigue. Men who had been steady for weeks suddenly broke, screaming at sounds only they could hear. Others simply stopped speaking, withdrawing into silences that no amount of coaxing could penetrate. The garrison developed its own coping mechanisms. Humor was mandatory, and the darker, the better. Songs about tragedy and disaster circulated through the trenches. Jokes about officers reached levels of obscenity that would have shocked anyone not facing destruction. The mess hall served the same food day after day, but cooks competed to make it slightly less terrible through creative seasoning with whatever could be scrounged. Bully beef appeared in forms that its manufacturers had never imagined. Hardtack biscuits were transformed into approximations of actual food through extended soaking and the addition of substances best not identified. Entertainment was improvised from nothing. Someone found a piano in the bombed ruins of Tobruk and managed to tune it well enough to play. Concerts were held in bunkers, while shells exploded overhead. A theatrical troupe assembled from men with any performance experience put on shows that would never have been permitted in civilized venues. The Australians survived the siege because they refused to accept that survival was in doubt. Every day they held was a victory. Every night they raided was a statement that they were not beaten. Every obscene joke about British generals was an assertion that their spirits remained unbroken. Rommel noted in his papers that the Tobruk garrison showed no signs of demoralization despite conditions that should have broken any normal military unit. He could not understand this. He was not Australian. But far away in London and Canberra, a political battle was brewing that would determine the garrison's fate. The relief controversy. Churchill grew impatient by August. Tobruk had been under siege for 4 months, and the British public was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why the Empire could not relieve a garrison of its own soldiers. Operation Battle Axe, launched in June, had failed disastrously. British armored forces attempting to push Rommel back from the Egyptian frontier had been mauled by German defensive tactics. The counteroffensive that was supposed to lift the siege ended with British tanks burning in the desert. Churchill sacked Wavell and replaced him with General Claude Auchinleck, who immediately began planning a new offensive. But Auchinleck had a problem that his predecessor had avoided. The Australians wanted out of Tobruk, not because they were defeated. The 9th Division remained combat effective despite everything it had endured. The request came from the Australian government, which had grown increasingly concerned about the attrition its soldiers were suffering in a siege that seemed to have no end. Prime Minister Robert Menzies had lost office partly due to perceptions that he was too deferential to British strategic priorities. His successor, John Curtin, was far more assertive about Australian interests. Curtin demanded that the 9th Division be relieved by British or Commonwealth troops and allowed to rest and refit. He pointed out that Australian forces had already held Tobruk far longer than anyone had expected. He reminded Churchill that these were Australian volunteers, not British subjects conscripted for imperial service. Churchill was furious. He viewed the Australian demand as tantamount to desertion. He complained to his staff that the colonial tail was trying to wag the imperial dog. The correspondence between London and Canberra during August and September of 1941 reveals the depth of the rift between British and Australian views of the war. Churchill argued that relieving the garrison would be logistically impossible and militarily disastrous. Curtin responded that Australian soldiers were not chess pieces for British generals to sacrifice at convenience. Churchill invoked the common struggle against fascism. Curtin asked why that common struggle always seemed to require maximum Australian casualties. The argument was never resolved through agreement. It was resolved by events, and those events would require one of the most dangerous naval operations of the entire Mediterranean campaign. The Relief Operation Supercharge, the Royal Navy's effort to evacuate the 9th Australian Division from Tobruk and replace it with British and Polish troops, began on the night of August 19, 1941. The operation required running convoys past German and Italian naval forces, through minefields, and under constant air attack. It required unloading troops, while simultaneously loading troops in a harbor that could barely handle one operation at a time. It required maintaining secrecy while moving thousands of men in conditions that made concealment nearly impossible. Naval commanders expected heavy losses. They got them. The destroyer HMAS Waterhen was sunk by Stukas during one of the early convoy runs, becoming the first Australian warship lost in the Mediterranean. Other vessels were damaged, turned back, or forced to abort their missions due to enemy action. But the evacuation continued. Night after night, destroyers threaded into Tobruk Harbor, disgorged fresh troops, loaded exhausted Australians, and ran the gauntlet back to Alexandria. The soldiers being evacuated were so weakened by months of combat that many had to be carried aboard. The soldiers replacing them looked at these scarecrows and wondered what kind of hell could reduce men to such condition. The exchange took nearly 2 months. By October the 20th, the last Australian infantry had departed Tobruk. The garrison was now primarily British and Polish, though some Australian units remained to complete the handover. The Rats of Tobruk had held their position for 240 days. They had defeated 3 major German offensives. They had inflicted casualties on the Afrika Korps that Rommel could not replace. They had proven that the supposedly invincible German army could be stopped by determined men with obsolete weapons. They had also survived despite, not because of British high command, but what they brought home with them would shape Australia for generations. The legend takes shape. The Australians who left Tobruk in the autumn of 1941 were not the same men who had arrived in the spring. They had been transformed by an experience that no training could simulate and no words could adequately describe. Physically, they were wrecks. Months of malnutrition had stripped muscle from bodies that had once been farm-hardened. Desert infections had scarred faces and damaged eyes. Wounds that should have kept men hospitalized had healed badly because proper treatment was unavailable. Psychologically, they carried invisible damage that would last decades. The nightmares started during the siege and continued for the rest of their lives. The hypervigilance that kept them alive in Tobruk made peacetime existence exhausting. But they also carried something else, a pride that nothing could diminish, a knowledge that they had been tested beyond any reasonable limit and had not broken. The Rats of Tobruk became Australian icons almost immediately. Newspapers published their stories to hungry audiences who wanted proof that Australians could stand against any enemy. Recruiting offices used their example to attract volunteers, but the Rats themselves rarely talked about what had happened. They met in pubs and drank silently together. They attended reunions where the conversation carefully avoided actual combat memories. They protected their children from the truth because the truth was too heavy for sharing. They had held Tobruk. That was all that mattered. That was all anyone needed to know. Yet the stories they told in private would reshape how Australia saw its place in the world. The British Betrayal Narrative. Australian veterans of Tobruk returned home with stories that did not appear in official accounts. Stories about supplies that never arrived, while British units in Egypt received everything they requested. Stories about casualties that could have been avoided if air cover had been provided. Stories about British staff officers who viewed the garrison as expendable. These stories crystallized into a narrative of British betrayal that echoed earlier Australian grievances. Gallipoli had demonstrated that British generals would sacrifice Australian lives for strategic objectives of questionable value. Singapore, which fell just months after the Tobruk siege ended, demonstrated it again. The pattern seemed undeniable. British imperial strategy treated Australian soldiers as shock troops to be thrown into impossible situations, while British units received easier assignments and better support. This narrative was not entirely fair. British forces in the Desert War suffered casualties that were proportionally comparable to Australian losses. British staff officers made decisions under pressures that frontline troops did not fully appreciate. But fairness was not the point. The point was that Australian soldiers felt used. They felt that their sacrifices were taken for granted by an imperial establishment that viewed them as junior partners rather than equal allies. This sentiment would have profound consequences for Australian foreign policy in the decades following the war. The special relationship with Britain that had defined Australian strategic thinking since Federation began to erode. A new orientation toward the United States emerged, based partly on the perception that Americans treated their allies with more respect than the British had. The Rats of Tobruk did not intend to change geopolitics. They simply told the truth about their experience to anyone who would listen. And the most powerful confirmation of that truth came from an unexpected source: Rommel's testimony. The most powerful validation of what the Australians achieved at Tobruk came from the man who had tried hardest to destroy them. Erwin Rommel himself, in papers and letters written during and after the North African campaign, provided testimony to the fighting quality of his enemies that no amount of British condescension could diminish. Rommel wrote that the Australians fought with a skill and ferocity that put them in the first rank of the opponents he had faced. He noted that their night operations were more effective than anything German forces could match. He admitted that his intelligence services had completely underestimated the garrison's capabilities, and that this miscalculation had cost him the initiative in North Africa. Perhaps most tellingly, Rommel wrote that his men feared facing Australian units more than any other Commonwealth forces. The reputation that the Diggers had earned through 240 days of savage combat had spread throughout the Afrika Korps. German soldiers requested transfers rather than serve in sectors opposite Australian positions. This enemy testimony was cited repeatedly in post-war Australian accounts of the siege. It became proof that the Rats had earned respect from the one judge who mattered most, the commander who had tried and failed to destroy them. British generals could dismiss Australian complaints as colonial whining. They could not dismiss Rommel's assessment. But did all this sacrifice actually matter to the outcome of the war? The operational impact. Military historians debate whether the siege of Tobruk actually mattered to the outcome of the North African campaign. Some argue that Rommel could have bypassed the port and continued toward Egypt. Others point out that leaving an active garrison in his rear would have created impossible supply problems. The weight of evidence suggests that Tobruk was strategically critical. The garrison tied down German and Italian forces that could otherwise have been used for offensive operations. The losses inflicted during the April and May offensives prevented Rommel from accumulating the armored strength he needed to break through British lines in Egypt. More subtly, Tobruk demonstrated that German forces were not invincible. After 18 months of unbroken victory, the Afrika Korps had been stopped by a garrison that everyone expected to surrender. This psychological impact rippled through Allied forces throughout the Mediterranean. If the Australians could hold Tobruk, then perhaps other positions could be held. Perhaps the tide could be turned. Perhaps the war could be won. The strategic significance of the siege became clear only in retrospect. At the time, it seemed like a desperate struggle for survival with no guarantee of success. But the story of Tobruk did not end when the Australians left. It ended in tragedy. The final battles. Tobruk fell in June of 1942, nearly a year after the Australian evacuation. A German offensive caught the replacement garrison off balance and overran defenses that the Australians had held against far heavier attacks. The surrender shocked the British Empire. Churchill called it a disgrace without equal in British military history. Over 30,000 troops became prisoners in a single day. Australian veterans of the original siege received the news with complicated emotions. Some felt vindicated. The garrison that replaced them had failed to hold what the 9th Division had defended against everything Rommel could throw. The British and South African troops who surrendered were not rats. Others felt grief. The fortifications they had built, the positions they had held, the ground they had paid for in blood had been lost in hours. Their achievement seemed diminished by the failure that followed. But the consensus among the rats was consistent. The second garrison had not been given the resources to succeed any more than the first garrison had been given resources to succeed. The difference was that the Australians had compensated for inadequate support through superior fighting ability. The second garrison had not been inferior soldiers. They had been ordinary soldiers in an extraordinary situation, without the cultural tools that allowed Australians to function under impossible pressure. This interpretation may have been self-serving. It was also probably accurate. And so began the long process of turning a battle into a legend. The Anzac Legacy. The Rats of Tobruk became part of the Anzac legend that defines Australian national identity. They joined the original Anzacs of Gallipoli and the Light Horsemen of Beersheba in the pantheon of Australian military heroes. But there was something different about the Tobruk veterans. They had not just fought bravely, they had fought successfully. They had not been withdrawn from an impossible situation. They had made an impossible situation work. The Anzac tradition before Tobruk was partly built on heroic failure. The original landing at Gallipoli had been a disaster, redeemed only by the courage of the men who perished there. The Australian military myth celebrated sacrifice more than victory. Tobruk added something new. It proved that Australians could win against the best armies in the world. It proved that the qualities celebrated in the Anzac legend were not just admirable, but militarily effective. This shift had subtle but significant effects on Australian self-perception. The nation began to believe that it could compete with major powers on equal terms. The cultural cringe that had characterized colonial attitudes toward Britain and other established nations began to fade. The Rats did not intend to change how Australians saw themselves. They simply did their jobs under conditions that would have broken most people. But time, the enemy that no soldier can defeat, was already claiming its toll. The veterans. The Rats of Tobruk Association formed shortly after the war to maintain connections between men who had shared an experience that civilians could never fully understand. The organization survived for decades, holding reunions and commemorating anniversaries. But time accomplished what Rommel could not. Veterans aged and weakened and departed one by one. The reunions grew smaller each year. The stories were told to increasingly diminished audiences. By the early 21st century, almost all the original Rats had passed on. The youngest soldier who served the full siege would have been over 90 years old by 2010. The association that once boasted thousands of members shrank to dozens, then to handfuls. The final Rats carried a responsibility they had never requested. They were the last witnesses to events that had shaped a nation. When they were gone, Tobruk would pass from living memory to recorded history. Some veterans spent their final years giving interviews, recording testimonies, ensuring that accurate accounts would survive them. Others maintained their wartime silence, taking secrets to graves that their families could only guess at. The Tobruk War Cemetery, located near the harbor the Australians defended, contains over 2,000 graves. Most are British or Commonwealth soldiers who fell during the various phases of the Libyan campaign. Among them are Australians who never left the perimeter they held. Their headstones do not distinguish between those who fell during the siege and those who fell before or after. The fallen of Tobruk are united in the earth they fought over. And what did it all mean? The lesson. What does the siege of Tobruk teach about warfare, about national character, about the relationship between soldiers and the commands that send them to fight? The operational lessons are straightforward. Defense can succeed against overwhelming force if defenders maintain aggressive posture and refuse to surrender initiative. Night operations can negate technological superiority. Determination can compensate for equipment shortcomings. The national lessons are more complex. Australia discovered at Tobruk that its soldiers were as good as any in the world, and that its imperial allies did not always act as allies should. These discoveries informed Australian strategic thinking for generations. The human lessons are the most difficult to articulate. Men can endure conditions that should destroy them if they believe their endurance matters. Bonds formed under fire persist long after the firing stops. The true cost of military success is paid not on the battlefield, but in the decades afterward, when veterans struggle to live with what they experienced and what they did. The rats of Tobruk would not have expressed any of this in formal language. They would have said they did their job. They would have deflected praise with jokes and changed the subject to something less uncomfortable. But their actions spoke louder than any words they could have chosen. They held a position that could not be held. They defeated an army that could not be defeated. They survived an experience that should have ended them all. And they did it because that was what Australians did. The final roll call. The last verified surviving rat of Tobruk, Private Jack Capel, passed away in 2023 at the age of 101. With his departure, the siege passed from living memory to history. The memorials remain. Tobruk is commemorated in museums across Australia. Streets and parks bear the names of battles fought in the Libyan dust. The Rats of Tobruk Memorial in Canberra list the names of those who served during the siege. But memorials are stone and bronze. They cannot convey what the men who stood at Tobruk actually felt during those 240 days. They cannot capture the taste of dust in a parched mouth, or the sound of shells exploding in darkness, or the weight of a mate's body being dragged toward the aid station. The rats are gone. Their war is over at last, 8 decades after it ended and a lifetime after it began. What they left behind is a story about ordinary men who accomplished extraordinary things because nobody told them it was impossible. A story about Australian soldiers who refused to retreat, refused to surrender, and refused to show proper respect to generals who had written them off. A story about rats who turned an insult into a legend that will outlive every memorial ever built. The British generals who despised the ANZACs are forgotten. The staff officers who called them undisciplined rabble are footnotes in archives nobody reads. But the Rats of Tobruk are remembered. That is the only victory that matters.